Father Thomas Brennan spent 32 years doing exorcisms, witnessing wild stuff. However, on September 14, 2021, during a routine blessing, he encountered something so shocking that he vowed never to enter a haunted place again. What he saw in the mirror, his own face speaking words he wasn't saying, made the veteran exorcist question his fight. Get ready for 5 wild paranormal encounters. These aren't just campfire ghost stories. They're real-life experiences from credible folks who've had their lives changed by the unexplained. This is Spookfeed, where we explore the documented impossible. Let's begin. Story 1. The Exorcist's Reflection. Father Thomas Brennan was called to a home in rural Pennsylvania where a family reported severe paranormal activity. Standard procedure for a man who'd conducted hundreds of similar investigations over 3 decades. The Martinez family described the usual phenomena: objects moving, unexplained sounds, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Father Brennan arrived with his assistant, documented everything methodically, and began the blessing ritual. In the master bedroom, Father Brennan stood before an antique mirror while reciting prayers. That's when he noticed something that made him stop mid-sentence. His reflection was moving differently than he was. At first, it was subtle, a slight delay, as though the mirror was showing him a fraction of a second behind. But as Father Brennan continued watching, the delay grew longer. His reflection would move after he'd already stopped. Then his reflection smiled at him. Father Brennan wasn't smiling. His assistant standing beside him saw it too. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words, but Father Brennan's lips remained still. The assistant grabbed his phone and started recording. The reflection spoke, and both men heard the voice coming from the mirror, using Father Brennan's exact vocal tone. "You've been casting out the wrong spirits, Thomas. We're not the demons. We're what comes after you send them away. We're what fills the empty spaces." Father Brennan stepped back from the mirror, but his reflection didn't move. It remained standing in place, watching him with an expression he'd never made, a twisted combination of pity and hunger. "Every exorcism you've performed," the reflection continued, "you've opened a door and invited us in. 32 years of invitations. We've been very patient." The reflection then did something that made Father Brennan's assistant drop his phone. It reached forward, as though trying to push through the glass from the other side. The mirror's surface rippled like water. Father Brennan grabbed his assistant and ran from the house. He contacted his bishop immediately, reporting everything. The diocese launched an investigation. When they returned to the house with a full team 3 days later, the mirror was gone. The Martinez family claimed they'd never owned an antique mirror. The bedroom wall where it had hung showed no marks, no holes, no evidence that anything had ever been mounted there. But here's what keeps Father Brennan awake. The assistant's phone recording captured everything. The reflection is moving independently, the voice, the rippling glass. But when they tried to submit it as evidence, the video file corrupted. Every backup copy, every attempt to recover the data, resulted in the same thing: static and a voice whispering, "We're patient." Father Brennan retired from exorcism work that month. He now refuses to look in mirrors for longer than necessary. He's spoken to other exorcists privately, and several have confided that they've had similar experiences, reflections that don't quite match, voices that sound like their own, saying things they'd never say. There's a theory among some church investigators that mirrors, particularly old ones, don't just reflect light. They reflect moments, possibilities, versions of ourselves that exist in adjacent realities. And sometimes, something from those realities looks back. Father Brennan believes his reflection is still out there somewhere, still wearing his face, still doing God knows what in a world that mirrors ours but follows different rules. And he believes it's only a matter of time before it finds a way through. Story 2. The Nursing Home Visitor. Oak Ridge Senior Living Facility in Vermont maintains meticulous records. Every visitor is logged, every staff member accounted for, every entrance monitored by security cameras, which makes what happened in the autumn of 2022 completely inexplicable. Residents on the 3rd floor began reporting visits from a woman they called the Gray Lady. She would appear in their rooms late at night, sit beside their beds, and speak with them for hours. She wore old-fashioned gray clothing and had a gentle demeanor that put the elderly residents at ease. The staff assumed it was confusion or early dementia. These were residents in their 80s and 90s, and nighttime confusion is common. But then something happened that forced the staff to pay attention. Mrs. Eleanor Chen, age 87, told her nurse that the Gray Lady had visited her and told her very specific information about her childhood in San Francisco. Details that Eleanor hadn't thought about in 70 years. The name of her first-grade teacher, the address of the apartment where she'd lived, the exact date of a minor earthquake she'd experienced as a child. The nurse humored Eleanor, but later, out of curiosity, researched the details. Every single fact checked out. Information that wasn't in any of Eleanor's medical records, details she'd never shared with staff, obscure historical facts that would require significant research to verify. How had Eleanor, suffering from moderate dementia, suddenly recalled such precise information? She insisted the Gray Lady had reminded her of these memories, had helped her remember her life with perfect clarity. Other residents reported similar experiences. The Gray Lady would visit, and afterward, they would recall vivid details from their past that they hadn't accessed in decades. Lost memories returning with photographic precision. The staff decided to investigate. They checked security footage from the nights when residents reported visits. The cameras showed residents' doors opening and closing, but never showed anyone entering or leaving. Just doors moving on their own and residents sitting up in bed, clearly speaking to someone the cameras couldn't capture. One nurse, Maria Santos, decided to spend the night in an empty room to see if the Gray Lady would appear. She sat in the dark with a digital recorder, waiting. At 2:47 a.m., Maria heard the door open. Footsteps crossed the room. The chair beside the bed creaked as though someone had sat down. And then a woman's voice spoke, gentle and sad. "You're not supposed to be here, dear. I only visit those who are near the end. Those who need help remembering who they were before they go." Maria asked, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "I died in this building in 1952, when it was still a tuberculosis sanatorium. I was a nurse here. I held so many hands as people passed, and I made them a promise that I would help others when their time came. Help them remember their lives. Give them comfort in their final days. Why can't we see you?" Maria asked. "Because I'm not here in the way you understand. I exist in the space between memory and forgetting. The residents can see me because they're close to that space themselves. But you're too anchored in the present, too alive." The conversation continued for 20 minutes. The voice told Maria about the sanatorium, about patients long dead, about the building's history before it became a senior care facility. All details that Maria later verified through historical records. Then the voice said something that made Maria's blood run cold. "Eleanor Chen will pass 3 days from now, peacefully in her sleep. I'll be here to help her remember everything beautiful about her life before she goes." 3 days later, Eleanor Chen died peacefully in her sleep, exactly as predicted. Maria reported everything to the facility director. They reviewed the digital recording. The recorder had captured Maria's voice clearly, asking questions. But the responses were just silence. The Gray Lady's voice hadn't been recorded, yet Maria remembered every word. And she'd taken notes immediately after the encounter, documenting details about the sanatorium's history that she later verified as accurate. The facility director made a decision. Don't investigate further. Don't try to stop the Gray Lady's visits. If residents in their final days were finding comfort in these encounters, receiving help remembering their lives and finding peace before death, was that not a blessing? The Gray Lady continues to visit Oak Ridge Senior Living Facility. Staff members now recognize the signs. A resident will suddenly recall vivid memories from their distant past. They'll speak about seeing a kind woman in gray who helped them remember. And within days or weeks, they'll pass peacefully. The staff has come to see the Gray Lady as a comfort rather than a haunting, a presence that serves a purpose, helping the dying remember who they were, giving them dignity and clarity in their final moments. Maria Santos still works at Oak Ridge. She says she's never seen the Gray Lady again, but sometimes she hears those footsteps in empty hallways. And she's noticed something else. Residents who receive visits from the Gray Lady die peacefully, without fear, often with smiles on their faces. Whatever the gray lady is, ghost or angel or something else entirely, she keeps her promise. She helps people remember. And in doing so, she gives them something precious. The ability to die knowing exactly who they lived as. Hold up. I bet some of you are already Googling Oak Ridge Senior Living Facility to see if these stories are legit. Loving these creepy paranormal stories, right? Subscribe to Spookfeed for mind-blowing stories backed by real evidence. You'll love it. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. A search and rescue team found a guy lost in the woods for 6 days, but he couldn't remember anything. Story 3. The Forest Keeper. In October 2022, 8-year-old Tommy Fitzgerald went missing during a family camping trip in Olympic National Forest. Search and rescue teams deployed immediately, covering hundreds of acres, following every protocol for finding lost children in wilderness areas. 6 days passed with no sign of Tommy. The temperature dropped below freezing at night. Rain was constant. Survival experts gave the family devastating news. The chances of finding Tommy alive were approaching 0. On day 7, a search team found Tommy sitting on a log beside a stream, 3 miles from where he'd gone missing. He was completely unharmed. His clothes were clean and dry, despite a week of rain. He showed no signs of exposure, dehydration, or malnutrition. Tommy told a story that the search team initially dismissed as trauma-induced fantasy. He said a tall man made of trees had found him when he got lost. This tree man had taken Tommy to a place that was inside the forest, but not in the forest. A description that made no sense to the adults. Tommy described living in a structure made of living trees, their branches woven together to create walls and a roof. The tree man had provided food, though Tommy couldn't describe what he'd eaten, just that it tasted green and old. Medical examination revealed several anomalies. Tommy's clothes were clean, but covered in plant material that botanists couldn't identify. The fibers were similar to moss, but had a cellular structure unlike anything in their databases. Tommy's stomach contents showed he'd eaten recently, but the partially digested material didn't match any known plant species in the Pacific Northwest. Most disturbing were the photographs on the camera Tommy had been carrying. His parents had given him a simple digital camera to take nature pictures. The camera had continued working throughout his 6 days missing. The photographs showed impossible things. Images of Tommy inside a structure that appeared to be grown rather than built. Trees forming walls, their bark smooth and carved with patterns that looked almost like writing. Furniture made from living wood, still rooted in the ground but shaped into chairs and a table. And in several photographs, visible in the background, was the figure Tommy had described. Impossibly tall, its body covered in bark and moss, with branches extending from its shoulders where arms should be. But here's what made investigators question their sanity. The photographs were geotagged. The camera's GPS showed they were taken at locations scattered across a 40-mile radius. Tommy would have had to travel impossible distances to reach these locations, especially given the terrain. Yet the timestamps were consecutive, showing these photos were taken minutes apart, despite GPS data indicating they were dozens of miles from each other. When botanists examined the strange plant material on Tommy's clothes, they discovered something even more unsettling. The fibers were alive. Under microscopic examination, they showed cell activity, growing slowly even after being removed from Tommy's clothing. Carbon dating of the material was impossible because it gave contradictory results, showing as both recently alive and thousands of years old simultaneously. Tommy was physically fine, but psychologically changed. He insisted on sleeping with all windows open, said closed rooms made him feel trapped. He would spend hours in his backyard, sitting perfectly still, as though listening to something adults couldn't hear. 6 months after his rescue, Tommy's parents found him in the backyard at dawn, speaking to someone they couldn't see. When they asked who he was talking to, Tommy said, "The tree man. He checks on me sometimes, makes sure I'm okay." The parents saw nothing, but their motion-activated security camera captured something that made them pack up and move to the city within a week. The footage showed Tommy standing in the backyard, speaking and gesturing as though in conversation. And behind him, barely visible in the pre-dawn light, the trees at the edge of their property were moving. Not swaying in wind, but shifting position, leaning closer, as though listening. And in one frame, just one, the camera captured what might have been a face in the bark of the largest oak tree. Not carved there, but formed from the natural patterns of the bark, watching Tommy with what could only be described as parental concern. Forest rangers in Olympic National Forest have a saying, "The forest takes care of its own." They've documented dozens of cases over the decades where lost hikers, particularly children, survived impossible situations, found alive after weeks, showing no signs of exposure or starvation. Most never speak about their experiences, but those who do tell similar stories. Beings made of forest material, living structures that exist inside but not inside the woods, and the sense that the forest itself is aware and, under certain circumstances, protective. Tommy Fitzgerald is now 10 years old. He still speaks to something his parents can't see. He still insists the tree man visits him, and he's told them something that keeps them awake at night. He says he'll always protect me, says the forest never forgets its children, and someday, when I'm ready, I can come back and live with him properly. The family has tried therapy, religious counseling, and everything conventional wisdom suggests. Nothing changes Tommy's story or stops his one-sided conversations with invisible presences. And his parents have noticed something else. Trees near their home grow faster than normal, lean toward their house as though reaching for something. The garden thrives beyond reason, plants growing with unnatural vigor. It's as though the forest followed Tommy home. Or perhaps Tommy brought a piece of the forest back with him, a connection that can't be severed, a guardian that won't be dismissed. The forest, it seems, protects its own, and it never lets them go completely. Now, I'm fully aware that some of you are thinking, well, at least that one had a happy ending. The kid survived. Sure, but I'd say coming back from 6 days in the woods with an invisible tree guardian isn't exactly a win, right? Better than the alternative, right? So let's dive into the strange event in Keller's Ridge. Story 4. The Phenomenon at Keller's Ridge. Keller's Ridge, Montana is a town of approximately 1,800 people. On the evening of March 3, 2023, something happened that was witnessed by hundreds of residents, documented on dozens of cameras, and remains completely unexplained by any scientific analysis. At exactly 8:47 p.m., every electronic device in town shut down simultaneously. Phones, computers, cars, streetlights, everything. The town went dark and silent. Then the sky changed. Witnesses describe it similarly. The stars began moving, not the slow rotation of Earth's movement, but rapid, deliberate patterns. Constellations shifted, reformed, created shapes that had never existed in human astronomy. This lasted for 17 minutes. During that time, every person in Keller's Ridge reported hearing the same sound. A deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Not a mechanical sound, more organic, like a massive heartbeat. Several witnesses reported seeing shapes in the moving stars. Patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols that seemed familiar but unreadable. A few claimed the stars formed what looked like eyes, staring down at the town with impossible intelligence. Then, at 9:04 p.m., everything returned to normal. Stars in their proper positions, electronics rebooting, the world resuming its usual function. But Keller's Ridge was changed. In the days following, residents began reporting shared dreams. Hundreds of people having the same nightmare, standing in a vast empty space, stars impossibly close, and a voice speaking in a language that wasn't language but pure meaning, saying something that translated roughly as, "We see you now. We remember you." The astronomical community tried to explain it as mass hallucination, perhaps caused by some environmental factor. But the electronic shutdown was real, documented by power companies and internet service providers. 17 minutes of complete system failure, affecting only Keller's Ridge, with no technical explanation. Cameras that had been recording during the event captured the moving stars. Multiple devices, different manufacturers, all showing the same impossible phenomenon. Astronomical patterns that violated physics, celestial mechanics, and common sense. One astronomer, Dr. Sarah Lindstrom from Montana State University, analyzed the footage extensively. She published one paper on her findings, before abruptly withdrawing from the research and refusing all further comment. Her paper, still available online, concludes with a disturbing observation. The pattern of star movement, when analyzed mathematically, wasn't random. It followed a structure, a repeating sequence that, when converted to binary, could be interpreted as data. Dr. Lindstrom's paper included the first few lines of this data translation. It appeared to be coordinates. Not Earth coordinates, but three-dimensional spatial coordinates of a type that would only make sense for locating something in interstellar space. The coordinates pointed to an empty region between stars, roughly 40 light-years from Earth. A region of space that, according to astronomical surveys, contains nothing of interest. But here's what made Dr. Lindstrom stop her research. When she plugged those coordinates into astronomical databases, she found something that shouldn't exist. Records of a signal detected in 1977, the famous WOW signal that scientists have never explained. That signal came from the exact coordinates indicated by the Keller's Ridge star patterns. A signal received 46 years ago from something that somehow knew to mark its location in the sky above a small Montana town in 2023, using a method that would only be understood by analyzing camera footage that wouldn't exist for decades. It's as though something sent a message in 1977, then waited patiently until the right moment, the right technology, the right witnesses existed to understand what it was saying. Keller's Ridge residents have tried to return to normal life, but the shared dreams continue. The sense that something vast and incomprehensible noticed their small town, marked it somehow, and may someday return. The town has seen a population decline of almost 300 people since March 2023. Families moving away, unable to shake the feeling of being watched from above. Unable to look at the night sky without wondering if those stars are really stars, or something else, something aware, studying humanity with alien curiosity. And every few months, someone in Keller's Ridge reports seeing the stars move again, just for a second. Just long enough to spell out one word in constellations that shift like living things. Soon. Whatever made contact with Keller's Ridge that night in March hasn't forgotten about them. And the residents live with the terrible knowledge that they've been marked, noticed, selected for something they can't understand, by an intelligence that makes our greatest human achievements look like children's drawings. The stars remember. And they're watching. Story 5. The hospice recordings. This last account is unsettling and challenges what modern medicine says about death. Meadowbrook Hospice in Oregon provides end-of-life care with dignity and compassion. In 2022, a nurse named David Palacios began a personal project. With permission from patients and families, he recorded the final words of dying patients. His intention was therapeutic, creating a legacy for families, capturing last messages and memories. What he captured instead has left him questioning the fundamental nature of consciousness and what happens when we die. David recorded over 60 patients in their final hours. Most recordings are exactly what you'd expect. Expressions of love, final goodbyes, memories shared, fear and acceptance mixed. But 17 of the recordings contain something else. In these 17 cases, patients in their final moments began speaking in voices that weren't their own. Different accents, different speech patterns, sometimes different languages that the patients had never spoken in their lives. One patient, an 82-year-old woman named Martha Green, who'd lived her entire life in Oregon, suddenly began speaking fluent Mandarin Chinese in her final 30 minutes. Her family confirmed she'd never studied the language, never traveled to China, and had no exposure to Mandarin. David found a translator. The Mandarin phrases Martha spoke were introductions, greetings, as though she were meeting people and introducing herself. Hello, I'm Martha. Yes, I just arrived. No, I understand now. I see. Another patient, a man who'd been mostly unresponsive for days, suddenly sat up and began speaking with a British accent, describing a city that his wife didn't recognize. He talked about buildings made of light, streets that flowed like water, and people who looked human but weren't quite right. Their faces, he said in that strange accent, they're beautiful, but they have too many eyes. Why do they have so many eyes? David's most disturbing recording involved a woman named Claire Santos. In her final hour, Claire's voice changed 7 times. Different people, different personalities, speaking through her. Each one introduced themselves, asking where they were, expressing confusion and wonder. It was as though Claire had become a doorway, and multiple consciousnesses were passing through her, taking temporary residence in her failing body before moving on to whatever comes next. The final voice that spoke through Claire said something that David had never shared publicly until now. She's helping us cross. This is what she chose. To be a bridge in her dying. How beautiful. How selfless. Then Claire died, and the voice stopped. David brought his recordings to medical researchers, to consciousness studies experts, to anyone who might explain what he'd documented. Most dismissed it as dying brain activity, random neural firing creating linguistic patterns. But one researcher, Dr. Michael Torres, spent 6 months analyzing the recordings. His unofficial conclusion: the voices show linguistic patterns consistent with individual personalities. Different syntax, different vocabulary choices, different emotional markers. Not random brain activity, but structured communication from what appears to be separate consciousnesses. Dr. Torres's analysis remained unpublished because no journal would accept it. The implications were too radical, suggesting that dying patients might temporarily host other consciousnesses, that death might be a transition point where multiple realities or dimensions briefly intersect. David continues his recording project, but he no longer sees it as preserving final messages. He sees it as documenting something profound, evidence that consciousness doesn't end at death, but transforms, moves, possibly merges with something larger. He's captured dozens more cases of patients speaking in unknown voices, describing impossible places, greeting people who aren't visible to anyone else in the room. And he's noticed a pattern. Patients who experience these multi-voice transitions die peacefully without pain, often with expressions of wonder on their faces, as though they're seeing something beautiful, something that transforms fear into acceptance. Whatever dying is, David believes, it's not the end we've been taught to expect. It's a doorway, a transition, a moment when the boundaries between individual consciousness and something greater become permeable. The dying aren't leaving existence. They're joining something. And occasionally they let us glimpse what that joining looks like. David's recordings continue. Each one adds more evidence to a disturbing possibility, that death isn't darkness, but a kind of awakening we can't understand until we experience it ourselves. 5 wild paranormal stories that'll blow your mind. An exorcist sees a reflection that feels too real. A nurse helps dying folks remember their past. A kid is watched over by forest spirits. A town is touched by cosmic mysteries. And patients become gateways to another consciousness. These aren't just scary stories. They're real accounts showing we don't fully grasp reality, consciousness, or even death yet. Life's full of surprises, showing us how little we really know, right? Tonight's paranormal journey has you questioning what's possible, just what we love at Spookfeed. We explore real stories backed by witnesses and evidence that challenge what we think we know about reality and existence. Subscribe to Spookfeed right now and activate your notifications. We drop new investigations weekly, all well-researched and backed by solid documentation. Drop a comment and tell us your wildest, unexplainable experiences. Who knows, your story might just make it into our next investigation. Every day the impossible happens, showing us that reality is way more complex than we think. Keep your mind open. The paranormal is all about exploring our own consciousness, right? That's a wrap for Spookfeed. Keep questioning, and let's explore more mysteries next time. Good night, and remember, the unexplainable isn't always frightening. Sometimes it's simply true.